Hi everyone! Welcome to our discussion on narrative analysis or small story research. We're going to be discussing the readings from Vasquez, who's with the University of South Florida. So, the first thing I want you to think about is the last time you actually told a story. Think about the reason that you told the story and what the story was actually about. The last time I told a story, for example, was recently I had a friend who told me about something very embarrassing that she had done in a professional context, and so I shared a story with her, my own narrative, as a response about something somewhat similar, another embarrassing incident. And later I thought about the function of that story in our discourse, and I think the function was to reassure her that everyone makes mistakes and funny, embarrassing things frequently do occur in all of our lives. So it was sort of a professional context in terms of the overall reason for our discourse, but it was also a personal kind of reflective tale. So I want us to think about the roles of storytelling in our everyday personal and professional lives, which is the kind of thing that Vasquez is addressing with her research. And narratives are ubiquitous, so once we start thinking about them and looking for them, we'll realize that they're actually everywhere. How about in our professional lives as teachers and graduate students? Can you think of the last time you shared a narrative, maybe in the break room or with your classmates before or after class? Can you think about the reasons why we might do that and the purposes that those narratives might serve and how people respond to them in our discourse? So this is the kind of thing that we'll be discussing. So first we have to be able to identify the component parts of narratives to really say what narratives actually are. And previous researchers, of course, have done this. And some of the narratives that they've uncovered have been things like teachers' autobiographies, their written reflections. Other researchers have studied journal writings and those kinds of things. But also, now more recently, researchers are considering stories that are told in the context of broader conversations. So for instance, stories told in staff rooms, stories told in post-observation meetings, mentor teachers with their mentees, and stories told in classrooms by teachers and students for different purposes. So what do narratives consist of? Again, these component parts. Previous researchers in linguistics have identified that a narrative, Labov and Wiletsky, is a minimum of two temporally and sequentially linked narrative clauses, which denote some type of problem, or what they refer to as the complicating action, and the resolution for this problem. And typically there is an evaluation with points of view. It could be the narrator's evaluation, or it could be the point of view of others included in the narrative. And we'll talk about examples of this. So what are some examples of narratives in relation to identity? How do our uses of narratives, how do these purposes relate to us as people in our different facets of our identity? So ways that speakers display a particular image of themselves has been examined, and there are stories of our professional selves that are complex and multifaceted that we include in our discourses. So for example, a manager might want to appear to be firm, authoritative maybe, because she or he is a manager, yet also funny and good-natured to create a sort of balance. So this is one way it could relate to identity. In turn, a professor might want to be seen as a knowledgeable expert, but also an ordinary person who's approachable. So these are the kinds of things that have surfaced in earlier studies. What is narrative inquiry? Autobiographical big stories, the so-called big stories, were from language learner and language teacher autobiographies, memoirs, so these kinds of formal settings in some cases. And they were researcher elicited narratives. They were decontextualized. Participants, for instance, were examined. Labov had asked them to share a near-death experience, to describe a near-death experience, and so in that description, other things were actually being identified as the point of that research, but they tended to share lots and lots of narratives, of course. These were formally elicited, and the purpose of that research was to look at phonological variation in unmonitored language use, some spontaneous language use, but later it was interesting for researchers to examine what the narratives consisted of, the patterns that appeared again and again. So what is narrative analysis? As in contrast to narrative inquiry, which I just mentioned with the big stories, narrative analysis is examining small stories, narratives that occur in everyday mundane conversations. So we share these without even really reflecting or thinking about them typically. They occur in context. They might be told in the classroom, the break room, private office meetings, on the playground, maybe when you give advice to someone about a career or a situation or problem. They look very different from the ones that have been found in the so-called big story research context. And researchers now examine how non-elicited narratives, these natural narratives in conversation, are unpolished and tell us something about who we are. As I said, they are related to identity in many ways. So these researchers have also examined the multiple possible narrative functions. For instance, in a study in '99, Richards looked at ESL teachers' narratives in a professional context outside of the classroom, looking at language, school staff, discourse in the staff room. And he analyzed casual chats during breaks and found that joint storytelling reinforced their relationship between these professionals and created this culture of collaboration where they discussed challenges with their individual students to help each other work through their issues. So I think because we're all teachers with different degrees of experience, we've done this to some extent and found it useful. Other people sharing their professional stories with us so we could gain insight from their experiences, and maybe us doing the same thing as well. Vasquez in 2007 examined ESL teachers' narratives in post-observation meetings. So again, these were novice teachers and their mentors. And the stories were told in the broader context of the mentoring conversations. She found variation in their moral stance. So sometimes the teachers were reflective and certain, but sometimes they were also uncertain or even doubtful. This type of narrative tells us about the many ways in which teachers do reflect on their practices. So this is kind of the practical aspect of this research for us understanding how teachers operate in their workplace. Other aspects of narratives have been investigated by Ochs, who identified things like tellership, whether there's one primary teller or multiple co-tellers, tellability, the significance of the story for the listeners and the speaker, the embeddedness, how detached or embedded the narrative is in the broader discourse. Is it very related to what preceded and follows? The linearity, so how the sequence of the narratives is organized, if it's very nonlinear or linear, and the various potential functions. If sometimes we share a narrative just to entertain, maybe to build solidarity, to come closer to others, maybe to pinpoint and resolve tensions, to justify our actions. It could be to construct our identity in various ways or to establish social norms. And there are many others, but these are just some of those that we can think about when you identify your own narratives for our mini analysis. And Vasquez finally found that there were two types of themes in her research for the narrative types for reflective narratives that depict a speaker's internal states or cognitive processes, so the teacher's thoughts or actions during the class that was observed, for instance, her own decision-making process during the lesson, or relational narratives that highlight the interaction between two individuals. So teachers sometimes had challenges with a particular student and shared the incident, describing what happened and the outcome of that scenario. So what you'll do for your mini analysis, which is also our Moodle discussion, it's going to be combined this week, is to select a narrative in any environment and to describe the component parts that you find in the narrative. And I've shared an example on Moodle of this. It's simpler than it sounds, and it's directly related to what Vasquez has told us these component parts could be. So I'm looking forward to reading about your narratives and finding out what kinds of interesting contexts and purposes the narratives relate to. All right, see you soon.